All right, let's talk a little bit about tidy data. So in order to do effective data exploratory data analysis, you need to have your data in a format that facilitates that analysis. So even though it is very obvious once you get into doing your EDA process, it's only been common in the last couple of years to refer to data that's ready for analysis and modeling as tidy. So it was pioneered by a guy named Hadley Wickham, who was actually a developer for R packages, probably the most famous developer for R packages. But this concept readily applies over to pandas as well. And you can see from this little snippet picture that the concept is that you need to get to the point to where your data is represented as a flat table, like an Excel table or a CSV, where the top row is the headers and every row represents an observation. And an observation means that it's one instance of your data. And each of the column represents variables or features, as we'll see is important in the future when we get into our modeling component. But once you have the data into this format, into this flat file, then you're ready to really start doing manipulation. You might think that if it makes sense to have your data in this format, that most people would already be putting in this format, but that isn't the case. So I want to show you a couple of examples of data that is not tidy, or I'll show you an example of data that is tidy. Okay, so we're looking at a data set here that is a CSV file downloaded from the World Bank. And the World Bank gives variables on GDP. So I just went out and I said, give me all of the recorded variables for GDP as a CSV. And you can see when I downloaded this CSV file, it is not tidy. So first of all, it's got 3 lines at the top that have nothing to do with the data itself. It's just a metadata note about the data. So it actually starts here on line 4, and then on line 4 you can see that the columns are actually dates. So 2009, 2010, and then those dates correspond to values in the rows below. So this data is not tidy in 2 ways. First of all, it's got this header that I just mentioned, and then it's also got columns that are not variables. Right? So if this were to actually be a tidy data frame, we would have country name, country code, year as a column, and then GDP for that given year. So we would have single observations that would be one observation of GDP with a variable of the year, as opposed to this table layout where you have the columns as years. This is very common. This is a very common thing that you see from places that you'll get data downloaded. It needs to be manipulated into a place that it is tidy. Let me show you an example of a data set that is in fact tidy. So here's the Titanic data set, and this is a famous data set from Kaggle, which we'll learn about more later, where the goal of this data set was a competition for people to forecast who actually survived the Titanic and who didn't. So if you didn't survive, you got a 0, and if you did survive, you got a 1. And you have these other columns that are representatives of features or variables for this observation of survived, right? And so these are obviously characteristics of individual people. You have their gender, their age, a handful of other things, how much they paid, what class they are. And each of these components then can be used to help eventually model an answer as to what characteristics related to whether or not somebody actually survived. So again, the basic goal of munging is to get to the point to where your data is tidy, and then when your data is tidy, you're ready to start an exploratory data analysis problem. Now that you've seen a couple of examples of data that is tidy and data that isn't, you know that at the beginning of every data project, you're going to have some step where you have to manipulate your information to a point to where you have this really comfortable common format. In introduction courses, typically you don't struggle too much with modifying data. We're going to have you do something in the final project that will require some of this manipulation. But for the rest of this course, we're going to hand you data sets that are already tidy. So you'll be able to start your exploration right away and learn the basic concepts using pandas. All right.